appropriated money towards the border wall, and also my concerns about making sure that we're thinking very hard about our role and presence in Africa as we see the rise of China in the area. But my questions are actually a little bit more mundane and have a lot more to do with regards to the committees that I serve on, specifically readiness and emerging threats. And my first question, and I have 4, and so if I'm not able to get time, I might be able to submit them to the record, has to do with just being a woman in the military. I separated, and one of the reasons I separated in the late 80s and early 90s was due to access to childcare. My base up at Hanscom Air Force Base was an expensive area to live in and had a 6-month wait list in order for me to access the base childcare. And so one of the things that I see with the rising presence of women in the military and the rising need for more people in the military, a population of 51% of us are women, is that we really need to be able to allow women and their families to be able to bring their whole selves to work so that we can support these active duty women and their families in their pursuit of their careers, and also so that we can be ready. And so my question is, with the record number of women entering the military, would you please be able to share with the committee what the department is doing and what aspects of the President's budget are doing to ensure that mechanisms exist and are in place for childcare and other such things to support the warrior? And first, before I allow you to answer that question, I would note that right now the base childcare lists are upwards of a year wait list. When I separated almost 30 years ago, they were 6 months.
And it's terrible. We've got to do a better job. This has been a top priority for me as Army Secretary, both child care and spouse hiring, licensure, reciprocity. I just spoke out in Minot and Omaha about this thing. The services are investing in terms of child care, but there's a lot we can do at the policy level and that I'm doing at the policy level. So just last week I signed a new policy that elevated military kids in terms of getting the priority of care. That is going to clean a lot of the lists out so that folks like yourself have access to it. I know when I was in service, my wife didn't have access to that type of care, and our son. And so the policy, a lot of what we can do on a policy side will free that up. The 2 other areas, as I talk to spouses or talk to service members that they need, are greater access to hourly care, which is important, and then more flexibility in terms of 24/7 care. That, to me, is the next challenge. Once we can kind of get that piece, is kind of move to those new phases, and I think that's what I hear from service members and from their spouses.
And I really look forward to working with you guys on this critical issue. I helped found the Service Women and Women Veterans Caucus, and we're about 50-some strong right now, the first caucus of its kind to focus on these issues. And last cycle of NDAA, we had some amendments that were successful in investigating this particular issue, and I'm really concerned about it. As we increasingly have more and more women, we need to be focused on that. General, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I would just echo what the Secretary said. There are a series of policies that can be improved, one of which is, as he mentioned, prioritizing military children over the non-military, non-uniformed folks that are entitled to the same benefits. And that's going to make a big difference, I think, in terms of these wait lists. And I have been 40 years now in the military, and my family's grown up in the military. And there's probably nothing more important than taking care of our families in order for the soldier, the sailor, the airman, marine, in order to focus on their job and maintain high levels of readiness. So it's a critical area, and we all recognize it.
Thank you. And with my last kind of minute and a half, I wanted to talk a little bit more about readiness, and this time in tech talent. I'm also an engineer and one of about a dozen in the Congress right now, and we, as we know, need increasingly more and more tech talent in the military as well. And last year's NDAA, one of the amendments, Armed Forces Digital Advantage Act, which I proposed, was part of the NDAA, and it established a policy to recruit, retain, and promote tech talent and digital expertise in the DoD. The bill was enacted in Section 230 of last year's NDAA, and it isn't supposed to be until May that I first hear reports on that. But I wanted to know, sir, if you had anything that you could report on that, and specifically the legislation also included authorization for a czar that would be effectively appointed. Do you intend on appointing that individual, and have you made progress on that?
I'd like to read the legislation, let the team brief me kind of what's in it, and then go from there. But I will tell you this much. This is very important. It's critical to the JAIC in terms of artificial intelligence, the cyber world. We have a deficit of people with that background of digital skills, the engineering skills. That's the one, as I talk to our people and as I talk to industry, that's one of the things we need. So I'm looking for any authorities that we can bring people in, retain them, do things outside the normal to make sure we can recruit and retain that type of valuable talent.
Thank you, and I have run out, and I will go ahead and submit the rest of my questions for the record, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Cheney. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Ms. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, we're hearing reports that as the United States is prepared to sign a deal with Taliban shortly, that deal may in fact include secret annexes or side deals. Will you give assurances to this committee and make a commitment that any deal the United States enters into with the Taliban will be made public in its entirety?
I'm not aware of that per se. I know we're trying to get folks in the brief in the coming days here, but I'm not aware of that. I would defer to the State Department in terms of.
So you're not aware that there is any are you aware of any contemplation of any secret side deals with the Taliban?
Nothing comes to mind right now that you're mentioning. I know, again, I know there's the base agreement and some annexes. I don't know if those have been agreed upon as secret or something, but I'll certainly raise that with the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We'll be raising it as well. I think it's crucial that the United States not go down the path that we saw, and frankly, the Secretary of State was so effective in with respect to the Iranian nuclear deal in uncovering secret annexes and side deals with respect to Iran.
We've tried to be very upfront.
Any deal that the United States would contemplate entering into with the Taliban should be made public in its entirety. General Milley, on this same topic, we've also seen reports that one of these secret annexes may in fact include some plan for counterterrorism cooperation, for some sort of a center for counterterrorism cooperation with the Taliban. Will you give the committee your assurance that you recognize the lunacy of pretending that the Taliban is a partner for counterterrorism cooperation and that there will be no center for counterterrorism cooperation between the United States and the Taliban?
I'll be candid. You're quoting things that I haven't seen. So, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I will take a rigorous look at whatever annexes are out there, and I have very, very strong feelings and opinions and lots of experience in Afghanistan with the Taliban. So I do give you my commitment that I'm going to give all of this a hard look. I'm not aware of anything that you just described. I'm not even aware of it.
Is it your best military advice, Chairman Milley, that the Taliban is not an effective partner for counterterrorism?
I would, I mean, here's my view on the whole thing, from big to small, I suppose. We've been in a military stalemate for several years. We're not going to defeat the Taliban militarily, and they're not going to defeat the government of Afghanistan militarily. So the only responsible way to end this thing is through a negotiated settlement, and that's what's happening right now with this reduction in violence, and I support that 100%, and I support signing a peace agreement with the Taliban, fully recognizing what the Taliban is all about.
But Chairman Milley,
I don't want to say.
But with all due respect, Chairman Milley, though, I think the question is making sure that whatever troop level we have on the ground is a troop level that's determined based upon U.S. national security interests.
It's totally based on
that an agreement with the Taliban, for example, that would include secret annexes, that would include counterterrorism cooperation or intelligence sharing with the Taliban, which is a terrorist entity which continues to fight with al-Qaeda, would be counter to that. And finally, I would like to get your best military.
Number one, I'm not aware of it. Number two, I would not support sharing intelligence.
Great.
With that organization.
I would also like to get your commitment and your best military advice about the extent to which a commitment in an agreement with the Taliban for the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces, that putting such a commitment in writing with the Taliban right now would by definition be counter to making troop-level decisions based on conditions on the ground, and would also undermine our ally, the Afghan government. I know President Ghani has specifically asked us not to make that kind of a commitment for a complete withdrawal, and that such a commitment, again, and any sort of decisions about troop levels that are based on agreements with the Taliban would clearly not be in keeping with making those decisions based upon what's in the best interest of the United States. And I would also say I think the issue is not a complete defeat of the Taliban. I think the issue is what do we need to do to make sure that our enemies and that terrorists cannot establish safe havens.
Yeah, and I think that depending on, I think the whole thing is dependent upon conditions and depending upon Taliban behavior. And if the Taliban do not agree to continued reduction in violence and so on, then I think we're in a different place. But right now, things are looking good as of today, so we're going to see. It's conditions-based. We're going to take it step by step, week by week.
The standard is that Afghanistan never again becomes a place where a safe haven for terrorists to attack the United States, period. And at any point in time, it's completely conditions-based, we stop.
I would just say, and I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, I would just say ensuring or committing now that we are going to have a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces in this agreement makes it very difficult for us to have the credibility that we need to ensure that we cannot, to ensure that terrorists cannot in the future establish safe havens.
And Ms. Cheney will have to get the last word on that one. Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Secretary Esper, General Milley, for your continued service and your testimony here today. Secretary Esper, is it safe to say that China is a central focus of the National Defense Strategy?
It is the principal focus.
Is it safe to say that the acquisition of additional ships and aircraft are a central component of meeting that central focus?
Yes, they are, in an appropriate time frame.
Is the construction of barrier walls or a wall along the southern border, is that contained within the NDS?
Homeland Security is part of the NDS.
But specifically, is the construction of border barriers on our southern border contained within the NDS?
Well, there's a lot of things. A southwest border, there are a lot of things that are not in the NDS that we do and we fund and we put troops against all the time.
Is the reduction in the acquisition of F-35 aircraft and ships as a result of the reprogramming of funds to build additional borders, does that make it more challenging to meet the central focus, in your words, of the rise of China as a peer adversary?
Well, I go, again, based on the recommendation of the chairman that he made to me formally, and I'd say, again, the items that were sourced for the barrier were what we determined to be in the FY20 bill, either excess to need or early to need.
Well, I appreciate, you know, your efforts to try to support the president's reprogramming requests, but you have been very disciplined and very focused on making hard decisions, the discipline and a focus that I share, as a matter of fact. And you have long spoke about the need to cut back on missions in places where we are addressing very well-established threats. In the Middle East, for example, in reducing troop levels where we know there are terrorists. And it seems entirely inconsistent with me then that you then support the shifting of resources from well-established defense programs that are directly tied to meeting that central threat at the detriment of the NDS. You know, I would just urge you to be consistent in your focus. The next question is, do you anticipate additional need for money or resources to meet the coronavirus threat within the DoD?
We have not had that discussion yet internally. What I'd like to do is consult with the chairman. This is moving pretty quickly, and then get feedback from my combatant commanders and principally General O'Shaughnessy, Northern Command, who has the campaign order right now, and maybe get back to you in writing on that one.
There is some urgency. I think that's urgency that we share and members of this committee share. Public health officials have been ringing the alarm bells for quite some time. I think we are out of time. General Milley, would you care to comment on that?
No, I think the Secretary is exactly right. We've got to get with General O'Shaughnessy and assess the situation, but also with Admiral Davidson and General Walters over in Europe, because it is spreading, we can't give you a definitive answer whether we're going to need additional resource or not. We are taking all the appropriate measures right now, and we're doing the estimates of the situation, so we owe you some answers.
The quicker you can get those, the better. Obviously, we're having the discussions right now about funding and resources. We'll need that information to make sure that we're working together with the Pentagon to meet what I believe is a very urgent threat. So we appreciate your urgency behind that. Secretary Esper, do you believe that climate change is real?
Yes, I do, Congressman.
Do you believe that it's a threat to our national security and to our military?
I don't believe it's a threat to our national security as I've traditionally defined it. I do believe it's a challenge for our military installations that are confronted with the impact of climate change.
Do you believe that the well-established threat of refugees, increased pandemics, instability, and increased terrorism that could result from all of that instability pose additional challenges for us from a national security perspective?
They do. It's a chain of events, right, that create certain situations. We see that in many conflicts, you know, over time it's happened.
So destabilization and mass migration and refugee does pose a threat to our national security.
Well, it could create the situation by which we are encountered with a national security matter that could involve the military. But that's a series of ifs and whens and thises and that's.
General Milley, do you agree with that characterization?
I think climate change is real. I think it is probably going to result in increased destabilization with resource depletion, water, and things like that. You're going to see increases in diseases. There's a lot of second and third order effects. And does it impact on U.S. national security? Yes, it does.
Do you believe that we're making the efforts right now to address those increased threats?
I think we're making reasonable efforts, yes.
Do you believe that there could be more that we could be doing to address the threats?
Right now, in terms of the international piece, no. In terms of our basing and infrastructure here in CONUS, which was one of the previous questions, I think we've got to look at all of our infrastructure to make sure that it can withstand things like rising seas and increased storms and so on and so forth. And that is a level of effort DOD's been
And the gentleman's time has
Thank you,
expired.
Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your endurance. I want to augment and reinforce Mr. Kelly's comments before he left here about the Garden Reserve. I mean, if in fact we use the term, if we're going to fight tonight, whether you be active or reserve, we need to make sure that the Garden Reserve is not viewed as a bill payer for the active component, because all we have to do is look back at the example of, let's say, 1953 on for a period of 15 years and what we had capability-wise or lack thereof in the Garden Reserve component, okay? I would, you know that, I just need to feel it's important to reinforce that as we do budgets and as we do bill payers, because it just, we have to maintain the capability of the total force. I would, one of my colleagues mentioned being an all-volunteer force. I would suggest to you we're an all-recruited force, because if you've ever been a recruiter, you know that you have a mission to accomplish. And where we have our long-term talent management, retention talent challenges is to retain the best of the best, whether we retain them on active duty or they do transition to the Garden Reserve, but those talents that we need to keep the best of the best for as long as possible in uniform. I want to switch subjects here for you on just for a second. General Milley, you mentioned early on in the hearing about a strategy-driven budget, is what I wrote down. And now, having used your terms, Secretary Esper, does the strategy include serious efforts to control internal costs, reduce waste, and streamline, if you will, a forward-thinking Department of Defense business model? Because we can talk about things and capabilities, but if our business processes are just funneling money down black holes, I need to hear your thoughts on what we're doing on that part of the strategy.
Absolutely. We have to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollar day in and day out. I think it begins in many cases with the audit. It was mentioned earlier, but not discussed. I'm a big believer in the audit. It shows you a lot about yourself. You look in the mirror and find out, you know, your inventory, where you're spending money, losing money, whatever the case may be. And we need to continue along that process until we get a clean opinion. And that will take some time. But there's a lot of process reform we can do. I think in time we will get there using AI that can help us a lot in terms of understanding our processes, doing better on maintenance. And then look, you just got to go back every now and then and clean. I shouldn't say every now and then. I think annually you have to make it a business of going back and looking at what you've been doing, whether it's, I call it the defense-wide review, and getting rid of the old, getting rid of the legacy, getting rid of the low return on investment. And that's hard for people to do. It's hard for people up here to do. And that's the only way we can kind of shed the past and keep moving forward, because you know, $740 billion is a lot of money for the nation's security, and we appreciate that. So I'm committed to making good use of every penny, nickel, and dollar.
Well, you know, you said in your own words the Jim Collins good to great. Every year, keep doing what you need to keep doing, start doing what you're not doing, but most importantly and most difficult is stop doing what you no longer need to be doing. Switching gears on you a little bit, Mr. Secretary, what progress has the Department of Defense made in their efforts to address the PFAS, PFOA cleanup, particularly in locations that maybe have a more immediate need? You know, I realize that the DOD is not the EPA here, and this is not going to be shouldered by the responsibility totally by the DOD. But what are you doing to keep up the inertia in the PFAS cleanup?
This is a nationwide problem, and DOD's been leading on it. Within, I think, the first 24, 48 hours of being sworn as Secretary of Defense, I chartered a DOD task force on PFAS, PFOA. They've been working for some time now, giving me updates. I hope to submit a report to this committee, to the Congress here in the next couple weeks. We've been closely engaged with EPA, supporting, we're going to abide by whatever standard they set. But I think there's a few things we need to do. We need to get a replacement for the firefighting foam. Number two, we need to make sure that we understand the impacts on our people, our communities, people, people outside our gate. And then number three, we need to just keep moving forward with regard to understanding how to mitigate it going forward. And that's kind of the commitment we've made, and you'll get my report soon in terms of where we stand on this.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Slotkin.
Just continuing on the issue of PFAS, since you have two Michiganders going right after each other, thank you for setting up that task force as soon as you came in. That was a great thing, and I was really pleased that on a bipartisan basis in last year's Pentagon budget, we passed the first 6 provisions into law dealing with PFAS that did anything more than just study the problem, including laying down the marker that you have to be off by 2024, off of PFAS firefighting foam, which is great. And to Representative Bergman's point, you're not the EPA, and EPA has not done its job in setting a standard for what's safe and not what's not safe, so you can't live up to that standard that doesn't exist. My question is this: based on DoD regulation, you all are required to live up to state environmental standards. The state of Michigan is currently reviewing setting up our own statewide PFAS standard. Once enacted and officially promulgated, will you commit to living up to Michigan's statewide standards?
I think if that's our regulation driven by law, we'd be required to. But let me come back and give you a formal answer to make sure.
Yeah, I think the people of Michigan would love a formal answer because
Right.
we're moving ahead.
I'm a lawyer.
It's happening. It's happening.
Okay.
Switching gears, I want to associate myself with Representative Thornberry's comments about the budget. And I want to take the conversation away from the wall and not the wall. People can have a big, healthy debate, and we certainly have, about the value of the wall. But I do have to note that there's an issue of precedent here. You're the first confirmed Secretary of Defense to ever voluntarily move money out of his own budget against the will of the Oversight Defense Committees. And that precedent is important for you, but it's important for every Secretary of Defense to come. So I'm concerned that we're going to become the piggy bank. The Pentagon is going to become the piggy bank for any pet project. Today it could be the wall. Tomorrow it could be someone's decision to fund a healthcare project exclusively out of DoD's budget. And I think I appreciate that you say you want to work with Congress and that you respect us, but you don't if in the end of the day, the money that we have appropriated is going for something else. The second issue, and I think you leave us no choice, but to look at what we can do to constrain your reprogramming authority. And this kills me, because I used to be at the Pentagon and I relied desperately on that reprogramming authority, but you've put us in a situation where to uphold our constitutional oath and the separation of powers, we have to exert our authority, and I'm sorry to say that. On where you're taking that money from. Of the $3.9 billion that you've asked to take away, $1.5 billion of it is from the Guard and Reserve, and Michigan is exclusively Guard and Reserve. And you say that is all excess to need, including all the equipment upgrades and requests. Can you say directly to the National Guardsmen and Reservists in Michigan why they're going to be 34% of the bill to pay for the movement of money? Please speak directly to them on why all that equipment is excess to need.
Well, it's excess to need in the sense that that's what was reported to me based on DoD budget in 20. Our assessment, I had a chance to speak with all the service secretaries about this. There was agreement along the same lines. I take my recommendation from the chairman here about his advice. But look, I say it not as a former soldier, but also a former guardsman. I get it. I understand. But we had sources we had to fill, and we tried to be very not arbitrary. We tried to be very objective in terms of where we took the sources. Okay. And the clearest source was early to need or excess to request. Okay.
I'm really concerned that you guys haven't done internal work on coronavirus. I was at the Pentagon when we were dealing with Ebola, and we didn't want to get involved, and then we had to get involved because the crisis was looming. And I would note that the president's request for coronavirus supplemental funds is $2.5 billion against the $10 billion that he's requested and moved to the wall. Tell me what you're going to do to make sure you're on this so that we understand your needs now, since there are some concerning reports that this could turn into a pandemic.
No, it's as I said to Mr. Crow, we owe you a quick response on this. This continues to evolve rapidly. We've been very engaged for several weeks now, not just internally, but in the interagency. And so I appreciate the offer, and we'll get that back to you soonest in terms of just anticipating leaning forward into it.
Thank you. And then lastly, I just was a little confused on your answer on climate change. I sort of heard from General Milley that, yes, you believe it's a national security threat. Secretary Esper, you were more caveated. The Pentagon itself, your own staffs, put out a report in 2014 that climate change has an impact on national security. Even just like more superstorms, et cetera, means more guardsmen and more reservists. Can you say yes or no? Do you believe climate change is a threat to national security?
So what you just said, Congresswoman, is different, and I agree that climate change creates impacts on national security. The specific question was, do I define it as a national security threat? I don't in my traditional thinking about how I identify national security threats.
General Milley?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, what I said, it has second and third order impacts on national security. I think the significant national security threats to the United States the Department of Defense needs to focus on is China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and terrorists. And we can't do everything for everyone. There's a lot of threats. There's infrastructure, there's the education system, there's climate change, healthcare system. There's all kinds of threats, all of which could be bundled theoretically under the rubric of national security. But I think climate change has impacts that result in national security challenges, such as resource constraints, instability, and those sorts of things in different parts of the world. Absolutely. So there's second and third order impacts. There's national security challenges as a result. But the threats as I define them are right in accordance with that NDS.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Chairman Milley, for being here today. To follow on some of my colleagues on Corona, I just want to be clear. We have a soldier in South Korea that has, but from reporting, self-quarantined. Mr. Secretary, have you given guidance to U.S. Forces Korea to limit the movement of soldiers and their families, understanding that this virus is very asymptomatic, that people can carry it? We don't know the exposure levels. People can carry it for weeks. Are you prepared, or have you given guidance, or are you
I've
giving guidance to limit the back and forth of those soldiers and families?
I've given guidance to the commanders with regard to protection of the force and making sure that we can continue our mission. General Abrams and also Admiral Davidson have acted very aggressively. Abrams has taken action already with regard to limiting certain things, controlling the gates, who's coming through and all that. They're very attuned to this.
I understand protecting the force there, but protecting the transmission back home through via our military.
Yes, it's not just local with regard to the commander on the peninsula, but it's also, again, the Indo-PACOM commander and our own folks at the OSD, PNR, in terms of how we manage this and making sure it doesn't escape us. And in fact, I got another update this morning from General Abrams on this particular issue.
Thank you, appreciate it. So just to follow on Chairman Smith's opening comments, and I think this is important that we begin talking about our competition with China this way, that we may be in a post-Cold War strategy, but I don't think Moscow or Beijing ever got that message, that they are currently in a Cold War with us. They're explicit, particularly the Chinese, in their desire to supplant the United States. It's a whole-of-government effort, taking advantage of our free markets, our universities, international institutions such as the EU and the UN. This is a concerted effort. Would you agree with me that actually the strength of the United States, but also of our adversary, China, is their economy, much more much more so than necessarily the military strength?
Yeah, I spoke to this in Munich last week. What concerns me, people like to make comparisons between China and the USSR, the big difference, or China and Russia. The big difference is the economic might and potential of China as compared to Russia. That could really feed their economy, their military, their innovation, et cetera.
So would you share my concern? I mean, we have the largest RT&D budget ever, which I think is a great thing, but I'm also concerned that we're funding Beijing's research and development. So would you share my concern that a lot of those dollars are going to institutions where we don't know if their faculty, their researchers, and many of the Chinese students are part of the talents program, and where that research is going? Will you share that concern that on the one hand we have such a large budget, on the other hand we could be funding our adversary?
I'm concerned about espionage, obviously, IP theft of our cyber systems, and I'm concerned about research that
Would
we
you
sponsor.
support legislation that limits institutions from receiving federal dollars, particularly DoD dollars, if they have faculty that are part of the Chinese talents program?
I don't know enough about the legislation or the Chinese talents program, but I'm very concerned about Chinese students in America or professors in America that have access to our research.
Would you share my concern differently on markets that U.S. pensioners and some of our biggest pension programs, including the Thrift Savings Plan, are providing billions of dollars to Chinese companies, many of them in China's defense industry? So essentially, indirectly, U.S. pensioners are funding the Chinese defense buildup?
You know,
Would you agree with that characterization?
I've worked on this issue in the past about China using our capital markets and others to fund their activities. Again, it's something I'd want to understand better before commenting. But I am concerned about Americans or groups providing the capital that China needs to invest.
Should we limit the TSP from investing in Chinese firms, particularly those that are funding the defense program?
I know, Congressman, I appreciate you wanting an affirmative answer, but I'd like to understand things and get my facts right and my data and my arguments before I commit to something.
Totally understandable. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Quickly, Mr. Chairman, on Afghanistan. I think the concern from Ms. Cheney, myself, and others is that the signal that we are prepared to draw down and withdraw from Afghanistan, the signal sent now, even if that is at some point in the near future, could cause a fracturing of the government, by extension a fracturing of the Army, which to me is the canary in the coal mine with the ethnic tensions, and essentially put us back to 2001. But here's my concern. Would you agree in your military advice that the Taliban has the capability, so let's assume they have the will to enter into a peaceful political process, how do they have the capability to enforce the agreement and keep al-Qaeda and ISIS at bay, where we have struggled, the coalition has struggled, and a 300,000-man Afghan army has struggled? So do you think they have the military capability to keep al-Qaeda and ISIS suppressed?
Unfortunately, at this point,
in the wake of a withdrawal?
That's going to have to be taken for the record because we're comfortably over time at this point. So you'll have to get back to him on that. Ms. Escobar.
Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. And gentlemen, thank you so much for sticking around and for being here all morning with us. Thank you for your testimony and your service. This is a hearing to focus on the budget, and I heard some things, a couple things that were alarming to me, and I'd like to drill down a little bit on them, in particular about the wall and the reprogramming of the funds that were appropriated by Congress. I represent El Paso, Texas, home to Fort Bliss, our second largest military installation, a critical key asset to our national defense. And so the juxtaposition of what we're dealing with is not lost on me, the kind of profound disconnect for me, that while we have investments that are badly needed, strategic investments that should be made at Fort Bliss, like a rail yard that could help, or rail improvements that are critical to Defender 20, and we have infrastructure that has been deemed unsafe, money is being pulled for a wall that is preventing moms and babies and dads and their children from seeking asylum protection in the United States, and that somehow is key to our national security. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Secretary, how will you ensure that a community like mine and Fort Bliss, that our soldiers who serve at Fort Bliss are not asked to rely on unsafe infrastructure when that money is being diverted for a wall that is keeping out those moms and babies and those fathers and children?
Well, Congresswoman, we wouldn't put any service member in a situation where it affects life, health, and safety. If you're aware of something like that, I'd like to know, frankly, because then I could follow up with the Secretary of the Army. But life, health, and safety issues immediately popped to the top of my list of things that we would want to make sure that we understand, but that has not been reported to me, so I'd like to follow up with you if that's the case, if you have something like that.
Okay, I'll definitely follow up with that. How does a border wall improve our strategic capabilities?
Well, the purpose of the wall, obviously, is to secure the border from illicit activity, whether it's trafficking of human persons, whether it's criminal trespassing, or whether it's, for example, it's counter-narcotics. In fact, in the case of the sources just drawn up, it comes under the 284 account, which is counter-narcotics. So that's the purpose, is to put a border up there so our Border Patrol can respond more effectively and quickly to make sure we prevent those elements from coming across the border.
Well, the funding is being pulled not just from those accounts, is that correct?
It's pulled from the excess to need, early to need accounts through the counter narcotics. Where we've been asked to support DHS is on parts of the border that are these routes for counter narcotics to come across.
And I actually, one of the things that I heard from you was about the funding being pulled from projects that were ahead of or in excess of need. And when one of my colleagues asked you, I think it was Ms. Davis, asked in more detail about that funding, you said, well, Congress put it there.
That's right.
And so are you essentially telling us that we overprogrammed in those cases?
Well, this is not unusual going back decades. But, you know, if we ask for 3 F-35s and you provide 5, we consider those 2 as additional excess to need in that budget year.
And I appreciate that, and I don't mean to interrupt, I apologize, it's just 5 minutes goes very quickly. So as we're looking to plus up programs that we believe are critical to our national defense or critical to helping reinforce the mission that we all share, it would be very helpful for us to know in advance where we see an excess of need. And, you know, obviously we know where some of those areas are, but I feel like this excess of need component essentially enables the president's, what I consider his usurping of congressional authority and usurping the will of the people. And so any help that we could get as we try to determine what those plus-ups are, and then we have to look for those offsets. Would love your ideas on where we can find those offsets to better utilize that money so that the wall debate can be had with within the Committee on the Department of Homeland Security and not the Committee for Armed Services. My time is up. I have a number of other questions, but I'll follow up separately with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lauria.
Well, thank you, and thank you both gentlemen for staying long enough to get to the last person and our newest member, Mr. Brindisi, as well. Leading up to this hearing, I wanted to understand the data-driven approach that I thought DOD would be using to develop their budget request, and in doing that, I referenced 2 documents produced by your department. One is the annual performance plan, and the other is the annual performance report. Are you familiar with and have you reviewed those documents, and were they used in guiding your submission to this committee?
I am aware of them. I have not reviewed them recently, and I'd have to defer to my staff. I can get you an answer whether it was used.
There's just a couple things that stood out in there to me. The first strategic objective in this document says that we should restore military readiness to build a more lethal force. I think that sounds like a great objective. We can all agree with that.
It's the first line of effort in our strategy.
Yes. But I'll dig down because I thought I would find some great metrics because this is a performance report and the goal is that you use last year's budget. How did you accomplish that? Where are we this year? And therefore that's justifying the next requests that you're making to achieve those goals. So the number 1 priority goal, 1.1.1, says to improve the department's ability to measure, assess, and understand readiness. All of us who've served, we're familiar with the DERS system. I'm assuming that it's referring to that. And so it's 2020, and our goal is still to figure out how to report our readiness. And I even found a 1998 GAO study on military readiness that actually says in 1998 that for more than a decade, various audits and oversight organizations have questioned the thoroughness and reliability of DoD reports on readiness. So you add all this up, I'm not great at math here, but over 30 years, we've been trying to figure out how to report our readiness. And then, you know, digging in further in your budget outline, you've specifically say that you're going to give $125 billion to readiness, and then within each service, Army $3.4 billion, Navy, Marine Corps $2.7, Air Force $1.7, additional funds to readiness. And also in your comments today, you said you support the Navy's decision to fund readiness. Mm-hmm. But if we can't even find out, if we don't even know what our readiness is, if we don't even know where, you know, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I think one of the changes I made when I came in is to get a better accounting of readiness. So we've changed the system. So and we're making a lot of great progress working between OSD and the Joint Staff, where we
but
measure.
It's still your number 1 objective, is to actually figure out what readiness is?
No, I think we have good metrics on readiness. We now assess it based on our immediate reaction
So this
force.
document is maybe not accurate?
Could be dated because we've, at least since I've been on the job now 9 months, we're continuing to evolve the process and make changes, so we better understand, based on war plans, contingency plans, what do we need and when do we need it, so that we're prepared to put that at a highest readiness level, a second readiness level, et cetera.
Okay, so I appreciate that feedback. You feel like you have improvement, you have a better idea of readiness. It just was not reflected in this document, which was portrayed as being part of the process in developing the budget. So that was unclear to me. And, I do want to associate myself with the comments from Mr. Courtney, Mr. Whitman, Mr. Gallagher about a concern about the direction we're going as far as shipbuilding, ship construction, especially if we haven't seen the 30-year shipbuilding plan. I won't reiterate at any length my concern about the optimized fleet response plan. I know that a study is forthcoming, and you indicated in the next couple weeks that I'll look forward to.
I think you and I agree on this issue, so.
Yes, and also the importance of strategic sea lift specifically, and just pointing out the scale of that investment. I know that the plan, I spoke with the CNO yesterday, is to buy 2 used ships next year, 1 the additional year. But if you look at the importance of strategic sea lift to get 90% of our ground forces overseas into the fight, for about $1.5 to $2 billion, we could buy all of the ships we need used, yet we don't prioritize that because we buy all this equipment, we can't get it there. And I know, General Milley, if you could expand a little bit in the time remaining, that you seem to indicate that we would just expand the tip fit. We would just look at the way to get the forces to Korea, and if we don't have enough ships to get them there in the time that we've planned for, we would just take longer. Is that something that you're reevaluating the whole O plan around not having strategic sea lift as designed?
Well, when we evaluate risk, when I have to submit my chairman's risk assessment, it's based on the ability of us to be able to do our task, military task, the mission, to be able to do that at an acceptable level of cost, expressed in the lives of troops, and do it in accordance with time. The time is a function of getting there on time with strategic lift, and that's going to be stretched out.
I'm sorry to interrupt, I understand that you guys are running short of time, and I do want to give Mr. Brindisi a quick chance before we get you out of here. So we're going to have to cut that off. Mr. Brindisi, go ahead.
Chairman's always correcting the chairman on time.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Esper, Chairman Milley, thank you so much for sticking around to hear from me, the low man here. You have terrific endurance to make it through all this, so thank you. Real quick, I wanted to ask you, the National Defense Strategy outlines that we must prioritize R&D and emerging technologies like quantum and AI because China is investing very heavily in those areas. Secretary, do you feel that we're investing adequate resources to keep pace with China?
In the 2 areas that you mentioned, I do. There's those 2, and there's 9 other areas where we've noted as critical technologies for the future, and we're putting as much as we can into those systems and trying to accelerate development. Okay.
And I want to ask, too, because I have an Air Force research laboratory in my district in Rome, New York, and in this year's NDAA, last year's NDAA, we established a Quantum Information Science Innovation Center there to really help leverage partnerships between DoD, academia, and industry. Can you talk to me a little bit about the importance of those kinds of partnerships in this area?
I think it gets to the issue we discussed earlier about having a broad innovation base and making sure we're tapping all potential resources, whether it's not just the traditional, big defense companies, but also academia, small innovators, entrepreneurs, the whole broad range to make sure we can deliver the very best for our warfighters.
Okay. And then I want to talk a little bit about counter-UAS. I'm specifically concerned about what our adversaries are up to, and I wanted to ask, because this same research lab in Rome is doing a lot of great work developing counter-UAS technologies to mitigate these threats from our adversaries. So Secretary Esper, Chairman Milley, can you speak briefly about how the services are postured to address the UAS threat?
It is a challenging threat that's constantly evolving, in many cases quicker than we can respond. We had all services moving out on a number of different programs. I consolidated that last year. We made the Army the executive agent, and now they're pulling together a much more focused effort that looks at fewer systems but tries to accelerate them. But we need to get to the point where it's much less hardware-based but software-based and going back to the roots so we can kind of stay ahead of the enemy instead of playing catch-up with regard to, and there's different systems. We have to have systems that we can we can use back here in the States, systems we can use overseas with partner countries, and then there's systems we need to be able to use on the battlefield.
Chairman Milley.
So the threat is increasing significantly in the unmanned aerial systems, and this threat not only applies to nation states like China and Russia and Iran, North Korea, but terrorist organizations are also increasing the use of unmanned aerial systems. So we're putting a fair amount of money, I think, in the development of ground-based counter UAS systems, and we're getting them deployed. And in fact, we're using some of them right now in the various locations like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Can you talk, to the extent you can talk about it, what collaboration is there with private industry right now around that? Because I could tell you that the lab that's in the district that I represent is right next door to an FAA test site for unmanned aerial research, and really the 50-mile radius that they have to test drones in upstate New York seems to be in an ideal location, located right next door to an Air Force research laboratory that's doing all this counter-UAS work. What kind of collaborations are taking place between DOD and private industry?
I know there is collaboration. I can't give you the specifics. I'd have to come back to you with specific collaboration incident or examples of collaboration, but I know there is collaboration with industry, and all of these systems are built by the commercial industry. So all we do is lay on requirements and then start funding the research development, but all that's done by the commercial industry.
Okay. And Secretary Esper, can you?
I think we need to take that back, Congressman, and give you a response, and I'll pass it along to the Air Force as well when they come up to testify.
That'd be great. And I'd love to invite you up there at some point in time to Rome if you ever want to see the work they're doing at the lab there, the Air Force Research Laboratory and the test site right next door there. I think there's a lot that can be done, and certainly they're on the cutting edge of a lot of the counter-UAS technology that's taking place.
Good. Thank you.
Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we are over time. All I have time left is Ms. Spear did have a quick question about TBI, which has not been covered yet, that I think would be helpful if we could just do that reasonably quickly. I will yield to Ms. Spear for those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very briefly, there was a total of 109 service members that were identified as having TBIs after the bombing in Iraq. Could you give us an update on how many are have been diagnosed, and what's the status of their conditions?
Item number one, Congresswoman, it's first priority for us is taking care of our service members, making sure they have medical needs are met and they recover expeditiously. I think number two, I think the number is up to 112 right now.
112.
Based on what happened. This was a new challenge to us. It's the first time we've seen our service members subject to a ballistic missile attack with a 1,000-pound-plus warhead, so we're learning things. And I've met with the Joint Staff Surgeon to talk about this in terms of understanding how these symptoms manifest themselves over time, what it means, might it change how we categorize, take care of them, et cetera, et cetera. But the good news is 70% have been returned to duty. The remainder are, some have returned home, some stay in Germany, but 70% have returned to duty and they've all been mild TBI, I think, is the assessment.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very, very much. The only closing comments I have are two things that were raised during the hearing. One, there was a couple of times when it was raised that we need to hit 3 to 5% above inflation in the defense budget in order to meet the national defense strategy. Highly unlikely, as you know, that we're going to hit that 3 to 5% number. So it might be appropriate to rethink aspects of the NDS and see what makes sense in keeping with the overall theme of making sure that our means match our desired ends. The other thing is on the nuclear piece. This is something we're going to fight over here in the budget because the $2.5 billion that was added to the NNSA is a big part of what's got Mr. Courtney and Mr. Whitman so upset, and rightfully so, and that we canceled an attack submarine as part of that. At the same time, and I hope it was understood that what Mrs. Davis was saying was she wasn't questioning the importance of the nuclear deterrent. It is incredibly important. There is, however, $8 billion in what they artfully refer to as uncosted balances, currently within the NNSA for programs authorized and appropriated for over years. If we got $8 billion hanging out in there that we haven't spent as planned, I question the wisdom of grabbing $2.5 billion to add to that, just to make us feel like we're doing more, particularly at the cost of the very difficult battle we have over making sure we have enough submarines and ships overall. With that, I'll yield to Mr. Thornberry for any closing comments he might have.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say I think it is also incumbent upon the Secretary and the Chairman to tell us what they think we need to spend. And if we don't provide it, then we have some of the responsibility for the consequences that come with that. Finally, I would just say on the unobligated balances, I think it's up to us to dig deeper into exactly where those funds come from. Are they intended for a particular purpose, a construction project that's delayed, a weapon refurbishment, for example, that's been delayed, and I know we've got some of that. So it is more into the details that'll be important. But I appreciate our witnesses being here.
I think that's a legitimate point. I will point out we had, some frustration on missile defense along these lines as well, that we were sort of getting ahead of our skis. So we got to have missile defense, we got to have missile defense. So we poured a bunch of money into things. We just, canceled the program after spending $2 billion and determining that it didn't work. That's the kind of thing we want to try to avoid in this area. I thank you very much for your patience in getting through as many members as we did, and appreciate your service and look forward to continuing to work with you. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman.
Passing by, if I can slip by, then I like that. But one makes me walk out. I think we have to look at a variety of options, as I said, including those that limit their ability to program funds. That's a bad thing to do, as somebody else said. Threats move quickly, technology moves quickly.